So I was a little surprised initially when I was asked to participate in this panel because I've been working in architecture for 13 years now. The only time I worked on an airport, our firm got fired from it. So I would certainly not consider myself an expert in airport design or aeronautics, but in talking with Andreas about the type of work that I do, which is focused on the design space created by surveillance, ubiquitous perception, kind of social media, artificial intelligence as part of environmental manipulation. The airport, like in many cases throughout the history of architectural history, becomes a kind of lab, I think, for testing this. And I'm hoping tomorrow during the think tank we can begin to expand on that more explicitly. I want to go through a couple things that I've been working on in the office that I think relate tangentially to kind of issues of surveillance as a design space, but also artificial intelligence as a manager for big data for cultural effects. We kind of live in an era now where we have a ubiquitous perception. We are constantly being surveilled. Our identities are willingly given up to social media and other data sources or data structures through a kind of extreme quantity that Orwell himself would not have predicted. On the one hand, this can be, there's an instinct to go into a kind of dystopic response to this. However, I'm kind of more interested in if we're giving this ability that we can precisely locate every person, identify them, identify characteristics with them on a continuous basis in the built environment, how can we begin to utilize that as a design space? So just as a kind of joke here, this is a little regional classifier plus gender bending switching AI I threw together this weekend, which is continuously in real time transforming applicants from a CCTV feed into members of the other gender. You know, it's a two-day neural net. Sometimes it works better than others. And I also can do fun things like scare the hell out of my photographer collaborator on Google Chat when we were talking about our meetings. This is like my Buffalo Bill moment. But within that, I'm really more interested, less in kind of face manipulation gimmicks, but more about the idea of beginning to overlay the digital with the physical and utilizing these techniques to create alternative versions of the spaces that we live in, or augmented versions of the space that we live in, overlaid with the physical realities of those spaces. So in this case, I have an app which transforms and samples the images of an interior space and translate it into an urban environment. The idea behind this is that these things are about both kind of communicating characteristics from different spaces over long distances between things, but unlike something where you're compositing, in some of my older work I was compositing video across continents into singular kind of graphic things. The interesting thing about this is these cityscapes which it's drawing are unique to every single spot. So they're not sampling some other spot and then copying it in, it's actually generating it through a localized interaction with the kind of image of that space that it's in. Which means that even though there's a kind of coherence to the styles between locations, it is in fact a newly generated architectural space. Back in, I think, 2009, my career took a turn like I think a lot of young architects did when things sort of got funky with the job market. Because of the skill set that I had, I started to branch out with my, my work. Sorry, the little guy's moving. Where I was hired to, for the first time, get into like a data visualization or big data management. And the kind of problems that persisted from this project where I was generating a 40-foot interactive map simulation of the entire MTA system with buses and subways and ferries, although they make a much smaller portion of the investigation off of real-world data from the MTA server. So on the one hand, I knew every time someone swiped into a subway station, and every time someone walked out the turnstile of a subway station. And I knew when they did it, I knew where they did it. But it exposed a kind of reality of big data, and that is that we kind of simultaneously have too much information and not enough. And the real role of the designer in this case is to understand how to construct significance or value out of that information. For example, all of you guys probably been to New York. Like if you walk, I know when you walk into Times Square, but you got a lot of options about where you could be going after that, right? So in order to kind of correct these gaps in our knowledge, I began to construct models using Bayesian prediction in order to create a more accurate, in some ways, simulation of what's actually happening in the train station, because even though we have this hyper-specific information, it's still quite not enough to utilize it for design and decision making for, in this case, this was part of the Audi Experiments in Motion project. And that kind of ethos, like rereading Negroponte from an essay he wrote in 1969 at MIT, was the same exact problem he was having when dealing with machine vision back there. We just have like a much larger quantity of scale, but interestingly, the issues that deal with big system simulation persist. Kind of moving on from that project, I did do several projects which were engaged with kind of optimization simulation for more performative results, but I also became obsessed with the mechanisms which are transforming the images of our culture continuously. So I began to do a series of exercises unpacking various kind of ubiquitous machine vision algorithms. So like this guy is a perversion of what's called a motion interpolation script, which is used for making slow motion video, where it identifies, you know, the same object in two different images and then interpolates it between to create effect. But what I was interested in is, like, if we have this state where other things are perceiving the world that we're in and they're contributing to the aesthetic quality of the world that we're in, what are the kind of underlying new compositional aesthetics that emerge from that? In this case, like, you can see a kind of interplay between machine vision algorithms, which are designed to operate in the same way that maybe we would compositionally, where you see kind of clear flowers being emerging from the image. Those are those kind of classification machine vision algorithms, whereas the ones that are kind of doing the streaky stuff, those are working on a more pixel to pixel, I would say more inhuman compositional logic. This led to a series of exhibitions I did, which begins to kind of interest me about this kind of long distance lack of territorial specificity with a photographer in Japan, where we set up over a course of 2 years, probably about once every other month, she was doing an exhibition where I'd set up a server for her. She would continuously upload her photographs over 2 weeks that she was taking in whatever city she was in, and my machines would begin to interpolate and recompose them. So the exhibition became this kind of endlessly evolving, conflated compositional piece, which was once hyper-local, but also simultaneously universal. And interestingly for me as an architect and a designer, I'm actually not going to show a lot of architecture today. The reality is the kind of position of authorship is moving from the explicit design of the end result object and more about designing a mechanism which designs itself, which allows for the proliferation of aesthetic agendas and a kind of amplification of power for the single individual. We began kind of extrapolating that into a series we were doing where we were also using the DJI APIs to specifically coordinate a drone flight path with the machine vision algorithms, so playing around with identifying what's valuable to the drone as it's navigating a space and turning that into kind of graphic media composition. This is like looking at, it's trying to identify building facades as part of kind of its collision detection. So it's only redrawing the facades. It was obsessed with that graffiti artist named Too Much. I'm not sure what that's about. Yeah, like, here comes the building. This is basically just a kind of larger still version of that piece where we used a drone to take a site map for a large 25-foot by 7-foot print for Chicago Architecture Biennial 2 years ago, where we were playing with the same kind of machine vision tricks to create those kind of impossible oblique maps of or medieval maps where there's no perspectival distortion, but at the same time be a photograph. Some close-ups where I couldn't help myself, so once I fixed the orthographic projection, I messed it up. I'm going to skip this one. So within that work, I also began to want to three-dimensionalize that and bring this back into kind of spatial territory and material territory. So I began to question whether or not I could take some of the algorithms I used to use for kind of structural optimization or budget analysis and begin to overlap them in one kind of homogeneous data grid with the machine vision and interactive media pixel-based logic. So I created this installation on a kind of relatively small budget. Go a movie. Make sure the sound's off. Yeah, okay. Where I basically filled the gallery space with a uniform 1.5 inch by 1.5 inch by 1.5 inch voxelized grid that the automated design kind of algorithms began to propagate both kind of planar understanding about the relationships necessary for the mirrors to mirrors. There's a series of kind of back projected interactive mirrors. So there's an awareness of kind of spatial necessity for where those need to go, a kind of structural location. Structural adequacy is calculated into it, and it was linked up to the kind of local lumber yard, so it was continuously checking its actual budget costs or its actual construction costs against the price of lumber. These are just a couple of samples of some of the media that were integrated with it. I think probably the only one that I actually am kind of fond of is the one on the back wall, which was about creating a unique individual perspective for every member, or up to 6 users of the space, which we took a kind of, again, a drone flying perfectly horizontal and linked a person's position in space through depth sensors to that shifting perspective. So up to 6 people in the space would have their own unique personal perspective. After that, and because that immediately exposed a lot of issues, I mean, it was done on a fairly low budget, but the realities of like the limitations of this and the resolution was extremely coarse with that kind of 2x2 based voxel system. So we began to look at how to, I teach a lot in the robot house down at SIRE, across the street, which hopefully some of us will take a look at tomorrow. We began to look at how to integrate kind of automated and these same kind of AI-driven machinic behaviors into fabrication processes. So linking, in this case, a drone surveilled landscape outside of the city of Los Angeles with a kind of simulated terrain that the robot created out of sand, and then a 3D printing exercise on top of it. This is another version of that algorithm, which is continuously scanning and designing the object that it's creating while it's producing it. So there's not an a priori object that it's tending towards. It's a series of kind of localized behaviors. It's very small scale, but it's kind of thing that we're currently continuing to develop as a way of automating the design of certain types of foundations out in the desert. Just some of the final images from that. And more recently, kind of linking back to the first slides I showed, those slides I did over the weekend, and one of the things that's interesting to me about that type of algorithm versus the other ones I worked in the past is that they kind of seek to expand the design space rather than narrow it. So most of the optimization algorithms you work with are about taking a narrow territory and then fine-tuning it further, like I'm sure the wing designers on the boom jet, you get it most of the way there and then it tweaks it till it gets it perfect. These guys are more transferable. So this was a kind of exercise I started on where I was trying to train an AI into doing urban design. So being able to reconstitute satellite photos of uninhabited desert areas into cityscapes. This is an older version of the app. The new guy has a lot more intelligence. This one has a hierarchy problem pretty clearly, where it treats everything kind of at a homogeneous scale. But it has an incredible amount of detail. These are about 40 by 80 inch prints, about 200 DPI. So as I zoom in, start to get down to the single house level. And what I'm trying to do with this project, kind of in this idea of the platform thing, is at a certain point, or platform architecture, is that at a certain point we realized with the automated 3D printing that it's an incredibly energy consumptive and time consuming way of producing something. The idea of the kind of mass customization which permeated architecture for about 20, 25 years is actually problematic. So our idea was to pivot to a more sophisticated architectural intelligence, working with cheaper materials, so like the 2x2s previously. We're currently pitching this. I'll admit he's not quite ready for prime time. That is not a plan that's ready to go to the building department. But basically we just walked the entire scale down from about a 25-mile wide satellite view of an arid desert down to a cityscape, down to a single house within it, and then within that a singular floor plan. And where this kind of begins to tie back into the original thing, obviously there's some territories. Is this playing? Nope. There's some additional intelligence that needs to be layered into this. But I'm obsessed with the kind of hypo surface, say, architectural plan that it produces. And this idea that maybe we need to begin to rethink the kind of open plan and start to produce spaces which still maybe lack an inherent hierarchy in the sense that an open floor plan does, but has a proliferation of surface which both like makes it easier to compose kind of augmented media and digital overlay organizational principles and allow for kind of dynamic organizational concept using that overlaid media to produce those hierarchies for circulation and wayfinding over top of the kind of unhierarchical architectural plan.